So today we're going to talk about The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO, which is an amazing novel written by the Dominican-American writer Junot Díaz. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO was first published in 2007, but it is still widely available, and if you look at the description box for this video, you will find a link where you can buy it, and by the way, support my channel. Because this is a contemporary novel, I am not going to talk about its author. I think that makes more sense when I review classics than it does here. But I would just say that Junot Díaz was involved in a controversy a couple of years ago, but long after the publication of the novel we're discussing today. I want to address that, and if you want to find out more about the scandal, you can check out his Wikipedia page or search for articles that were written about it in the past. I just don't think that a review of his work would be the right place to address any of that, but I wanted to say that I am aware of the controversy. I am just choosing not to address it here because my channel is really not about that. So going back to the novel, I think that The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO is simply one of the best novels published so far in the 21st century. Lately, I know I haven't been reading much contemporary literature, but when I first read Díaz's novel, I mostly read contemporary fiction. Now, in this video, I will try to convey why I think this novel is so great. I will leave any potential spoilers to the very end of the video, and I will let you know when I get there so you can stop watching if you don't want to find out about the plot. But until then, whether you have read The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO or not, you can rest assured that nothing I will say will spoil the fun of reading it. And if you're new to my channel, welcome, my name is Juan and I post a new book review every Saturday. The best way not to miss any of my reviews is for you to subscribe and turn on the notifications bell. So let's talk about The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO now, shall we? And let's begin by talking about its narrator, which is, I think, one of the elements that makes this novel so great. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO is a third-person narrative. The narrator is also a character, but not the main character, and that allows him to observe what happens with a unique perspective. But what is unique about this narrator is his voice. He doesn't sound like any other narrator I've encountered in a novel before. The narrator here navigates comfortably between so-called high and low culture. His references range from comic books or popular TV series to poetry by the likes of Aimé Césaire. As someone who also has eclectic tastes when it comes to culture and who is not afraid of reading Russian classics, plug to my recent reviews of some of Dostoevsky's novels here, and also watching telenovelas, for instance, that mixture of high and low culture speaks to me. Why? Because I think the division between high and low is so artificial and so meaningless. So I appreciate the range of cultural references in this novel, even if I don't share many of them, actually. Now, like the rest of the characters, the narrator of the novel is of Dominican descent and also lives in New Jersey. The language he uses ranges from the most vulgar, crass language to the most highly educated version of American English. And his narration is also peppered with a lot of Spanish and Spanglish. Now, because Spanish is my mother tongue and I also speak fluent English, obviously, the code switching and the use of Spanish and Spanglish did not mean an additional difficulty to me, but I've heard some readers complain about this. Now, my advice to people who do not understand written Spanish is to just keep going regardless and don't get hung up on it, even if there are things you don't understand. I think this novel would make sense whether you speak Spanish or not, as long as you persevere with it. And you're going to learn a lot about Dominican culture, maybe some Spanish too. And Dominican culture really is not that different from the culture of other places where we also speak Spanish. Now, I will talk about the narrator more in depth later when I go into the spoiler part of the review. And don't worry, I will let you know when that is. Also, you can check the timestamps in the description box for this video if you want to know. Okay, so apart from the unique narrator's voice, what else is great about this novel? Well, you will also learn a lot about Dominican history. I know I did. In The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO, Dominican history is discussed, but not in a dry manner as you would expect from a textbook, for example. And it is also not shoehorned in as you would expect from bad fiction. How the narrator talks about Dominican history using popular science fiction as its frame of reference, I think is a touch of genius. The narrator likens events from Dominican history to science fiction and fantasy stories, which is both in keeping with the overall tone of the novel, because its main character, Oscar de Leon, is a science fiction and fantasy fan, but also it makes Dominican history compelling to a reading audience who may know nothing or very little about it. And it works. It really does. I would be surprised if after reading this novel you didn't want to find more about Dominican history, particularly about the dictatorship of General Rafael Trujillo that held a grip on the Caribbean nation between 1930 and 1961. And if you want to read another excellent but completely different novel about that dark period of Dominican history, you should read The Feast of the Goat by Mario Vargas Llosa, published in 2000. Or if you have read the Vargas Llosa novel already, if you've read it first, you will not struggle with any of the historical references in The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO. Reading the two novels confirms my opinion that there are many ways of writing about the same topics and make them compelling. You could try, for example, to get into Trujillo's mind like Vargas Llosa does in parts of his novel, or you could describe him as a villain from a fantasy or a science fiction story like Diaz does here. And both options work. But let's go back to The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO. Another important theme in the novel, and one that has an extremely specific approach, is sexuality. The way male sexuality is discussed in the novel is something that sadly would be familiar to many readers, both male and female. I grew up with the same stereotypes the characters must confront in the novel. Reading about this can be uncomfortable. Of course it can be. The narrator uses a lot of sexist language, but I did enjoy seeing how those sexual stereotypes and how people were being hypersexualized in Dominican culture have a negative effect on Oscar. I think that's one of the novel's greatest achievements. Oscar manages to live up to those stereotypes earlier in life, but then when puberty hits, he deviates from the expectation his community has of what a Dominican man should be like. He gains a lot of weight and becomes a dork. Oscar grows into somebody so shy that he fails at any attempts to seduce women. As a Dominican man, he is a failure, and that contrasts with all the other male characters in the novel. Because in many ways, Oscar withdraws from the real world. He has a rich inner life, and he fills his time making up stories. Like many people who do not like reality, Oscar begins to write fiction. In his case, that is something he does from the time he's in high school. He spends a lot of his time writing, and as anyone who wants to be a writer should do, he also spends a lot of time reading. That doesn't leave him with a lot of time in which he could cultivate an attractive public persona, take care of his appearance, or practice his almost non-existent social skills. But Oscar is not the only storyteller in the novel. In fact, he's not even the main storyteller here. The main storyteller is, of course, the narrator, who writes Oscar and Oscar's family story. Because we do not find out who the narrator is until later in the novel, I am not going to mention his name yet. What I would say now is that if you want to read a novel that goes into the subtleties of Latino lives in the United States and explores the role of race and sexuality in Dominican identity while also being a compelling, fun, and yet complex narrative, then you should pick up The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO. But of course, this is just my opinion. I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. Please let me know what you think. And now I am going to say goodbye to those viewers who haven't read the novel or those who don't want to hear any spoilers, between now and the end of this video, I am going to talk about the plot of the brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WOW and its themes in a lot more detail, and there will be spoilers. So if you do not want any spoilers, you should stop watching right now, and I'll see you again soon, I hope, for another book review. I want to tell you more about the narrator, but first let's go over the plot of the novel. If you want to skip this part, you could do so by using the timestamps in the description box for this video. Okay, let's talk about the plot. Unsurprisingly, the brief Wondrous Life of Oscar WOW narrates the life of the title character, only that his real name is of course not Oscar WOW, but Oscar de Leon. Oscar is a Dominican-American guy from Paterson, New Jersey. He feels like he doesn't belong, he struggles to establish his identity and feels unloved. In college, Oscar has a roommate, another Dominican called Junior. And I can finally say that Junior is the main narrator of the story, but more on him later. Going back to the novel, a large portion of it is centered on Oscar's life, but Junior also narrates stories detailing the lives of Oscar's mother and grandfather back in the Dominican Republic under the Trujillo dictatorship. Before getting into Oscar's story, Junior talks about a curse that would have come to the island of Hispaniola, that's where the Dominican Republic is, when the Spanish brought in black slaves from Africa. According to that legend, that curse is called Fuku. Junior's telling of the legend is the preface to the novel. Then, in the first chapter, Junior tells us all about Oscar's childhood. This was the only period of his life Oscar conforms to Dominican male stereotypes. As a child, Oscar is as charming as men from the Caribbean nation are meant to be, but then something happens that changes the course of Oscar's life. Being a charming 7-year-old, Oscar tries to date 2 girls at the same time, but he fails terribly, and everything goes downhill from there for poor little Oscar. Oscar's mental health begins to suffer, he even has to deal with depression, and also he gains a lot of weight. That all happens during his teenage years. High school is actually hell for him, but the more isolated he feels, the more he craves love. Oscar meets someone he falls in love with in high school, but she rejects him and instead stays with her abusive boyfriend. Soon after that, Oscar goes to Rutgers University. There is a change in gear then in chapter 2 because it is not narrated by Junior but by Oscar's sister Lola. This chapter focuses on the fraught relationship between Lola and her mother Belicia, known as Belly. The catalyst for the conflict between Lola and her mother happens when the mother gets diagnosed with breast cancer. Lola reacts so badly about that and she gets so mad about it that she becomes a rebel, and after some tense times even runs away with her boyfriend Aldo. Lola's boyfriend lives with his father and Lola never fits in with the two of them, so one day she calls Oscar and plans to run away with him. However, when they meet, it turns out that Oscar has brought their mother along. Lola is then sent to the Dominican Republic to live with her grandmother, La Inca. Once in the old country, Lola finds out about her mother's rebellious past. Belly's parents died when she was young, so La Inca is not her birth mother, but her father's cousin who raised her. We also learn many other things. So we learned that Belly had attended an expensive private school and that as a young woman, she had been extremely popular among men. Belly got caught once having sex with her boyfriend, Jack Pujols, and that caused such a big scandal. That episode and Belly's relationship with Jack brings to the fore a discussion on racism in the Caribbean. Because Jack had lighter skin than Belly, his family disapproved of their relationship. There is also here an intersection between race and social class because Jack's family also didn't like Belly because she was working class. Later, Belly starts dating someone known as the gangster, who happens to be close to the dictator. She just doesn't know how close. She doesn't know that the gangster's actually married to the dictator's sister. So this is an example of how the novel deals with Dominican history by putting its characters at the center of it. Belly gets pregnant, and when the gangster's wife finds out about it, she sends some men to beat her up. Belly loses her child because of the beating. La Inca gets really scared and sends Belly off to New York. The narrative then moves back to Oscar's life and focuses on his time at college, where he remains just as isolated as he was in high school. That is where Junior comes in as a character. They become friends, but life is not easy for Oscar. He falls in love with a student, Jenny, and when he finds out that she has been having sex with someone else, he tries to kill himself. Luckily, he fails and survives. After that life-changing episode, Oscar decides to become a writer and embarks on a project of writing a fantasy novel to rival Lord of the Rings. We go back in time again. This time, Junior continues as the narrator, but he focuses on Oscar's grandfather, Abelard Luis Cabral, so La Inca's cousin. Abelard was a distinguished surgeon, we find out, and even had his own clinic in Santo Domingo. He and his wife Socorro had 2 daughters, the eldest of which was the beautiful Jacqueline. In this section of the novel, we again get a lot of Dominican history. The dictator Trujillo had a reputation, a real-life reputation for raping attractive young women. He was so powerful that people turned a blind eye to his sexual abuses. And again, you can read The Feast of the Goat by Vargas Llosa for more details of this. So Abelard is understandably afraid that Trujillo would rape Jacqueline. He gets arrested for making some silly joke against the dictator. Socorro then gives birth to their 3rd daughter, Belly, Oscar and Lola's mother, and kills herself. The 2 older daughters also die, although it is never made clear how. Belly, still a baby, is sold into slavery by some relatives until La Inca tracks her down and adopts her. Heavy stuff. Now, back to the more recent timeline, we see Oscar graduating from Rutgers and becoming a teacher back at his former high school. Oscar then leads a boring, dreary life until one summer he decides to go to Santo Domingo. There he falls in love once again with someone who already has a boyfriend. The woman in question is called Yvonne and is dating a policeman known as the Capitan, who gets jealous when he finds out that Oscar has the hots for his girl, right? The girl who, by the way, works as a prostitute. Now, one day, El Capitan catches Yvonne kissing Oscar. And this is remarkable because it is Oscar's first ever kiss. So El Capitan has some men beat him up, and that is exactly, by the way, what had happened to his mother Belly all those years ago. Oscar gets beaten up in a cane field exactly like her mother did when she lost her first child before La Inca sent her to New York. Now Oscar survives once again and goes back to New Jersey, but because he cannot stop thinking about Yvonne, he returns to Santo Domingo. Everyone, absolutely everyone, wants Oscar to leave the country for his own safety, but he refuses. Unfortunately, he gets kidnapped by El Capitan's men, and this time they do kill him. Not long after Oscar's funeral, his mother Belly dies. Then Lola and Junior, who are in a couple, but because he keeps cheating on her, they decide to break up. She moves to Miami, has a baby with another man, but then moves back to New Jersey. Junior thinks that Lola's daughter Isis one day would end the family's curse. The end. That's the plot of the novel. As you can see, there is a lot of death, and there is an ominous sense all alone as we move between the different timelines. We discover the horrible past and the horrible end that previous members of this family met, and then we see echoes of that in what happens to both Oscar and Lola. However, the novel ends on a hopeful note with little issues. Junior is the narrator of much of the novel, so we must assume that what he knows about Oscar and Lola's families is what they have told him about. To me, one of the strongest sections is the one narrated by Lola, but in hindsight, I think I just welcomed a change of narrator just because Junior's style can be, how can I say this, an acquired taste. Junior is a womanizer, your stereotypical Hispanic macho. I know the type in real life, and someone like that would not have been my first choice for a narrator. But I must say that he goes beyond that stereotype here, and I do think that his voice is so unique that it sets this novel apart. Oscar de Leon is the main character, and for the most part I just felt sorry for the guy. I mean, he seems to be doomed from for most of the novel, and then in the end we do find out that he was indeed doomed. I also got a lot out of Lola de Leon's character, specifically her difficult relationship with her mother, which is not unlike some relationships I have witnessed between some women in my own family. Lola struggles to impose her own identity because her mother is a larger-than-life character, and like her, we the readers probably don't give Belly enough credit until we find out about her background and everything that she has gone through before moving to New York later in the novel. Now, Belicia de Leon, Oscar and Lola's mother, I think it's one of those admirable, strong women who work tirelessly. That may be a bit stereotypical, but as a mother, you know, she's perhaps far from perfect, but she does love her children and would do anything for them, and people like that do exist. When I first read The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO, its originality and ambition blew my mind. I found sections of it laugh out funny, and others had me close to tears, and I don't usually cry when I read. I recently reread it, and I had to marvel at the author's skill. I think Diaz manages to pack so much in, and despite the narrative complexity and the whole profusion of cultural and historical references, I think he writes such a compelling novel. I thoroughly recommend The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar WAO, which is perhaps my favorite novel written so far in the 21st century, as I said at the beginning. And if you have made it to the end of this video, well, thank you. And please let me know what you think about all of this, any of this, in the comment section below. And this is all from me for now. I hope that you are all doing very well, and I hope to see you again for another book review. Bye for now.